So in the previous video, I discussed how human consciousness, this I think therefore I am mode of consciousness that's really verbal and symbolic heavy, um, is has this big problem, right? This big void in its center, and that void is essentially uh, this sort of paradox, right? The consciousness can ask various questions like, "What happens after I die?" But it has no answer, right? It just can't have an answer to that kind of thing in its own terms, right? It can't come up with an answer through reasoning about it, writing about it, thinking about it. But that does not stop people from doing those things, right? That's why it's a divide by zero type of problem. Your mind can just spin and spin and spin and spin without ever coming to any kind of real resolution about these issues. And this has created a lot of different reactions to this fundamental problem, right? So in the previous video, I talked about organized religion, which is essentially a corporate or government approach to this problem, right? You essentially create a bunch of laws, codify your beliefs, right? Have a canonical set of beliefs, and anybody who deviates from that is punished, right? So that's like the Catholic Church approach, which dominated Western Europe, the European people, for I don't know, 1,000 years, more or less. Really, over that whole time, though, if you look at the history, there were schisms, there were heresies, there were people who challenged the orthodox beliefs of the Catholic Church really throughout almost its entire history. Like right from the beginning, there were people questioning its tenets, etc. Um, so, even though the Catholic Church was in this dominant position in Western Europe, people were still thinking and coming up with their own ideas, obviously, right? So that corporate control wasn't 100% effective, but it was really dominant for so many centuries. But eventually it broke up, right? Eventually it sort of fell apart. And this same kind of thing plays out elsewhere in the world. I discussed this Japanese cult, Aum Shinrikyo, which flourished in the Japan of the late 1980s, in a Japan where prior religious traditions, not like the Catholic Church, but there are specific local variants on this attempt to solve this problem, where those institutions and those ideas had been destroyed, maybe a handful of times, especially after World War II, right? So whatever system of belief Imperial Japan enforced upon the nation, that was destroyed almost completely after World War II. It was replaced with something else, right? And it left the population open to kind of scammers and cult leaders, right? Like the Shoko Asahara guy, who was the cult leader of Aum Shinrikyo. So I think Aum Shinrikyo was a specific type of cult, right? If you're going to categorize these different groups and categorize them with respect to this void problem, right? Their specific attempt to answer life's big questions revolved around the Shoko Asahara guy and his crazy self-belief, right? So I think that dude, Shoko Asahara, was a true believer in his own bullshit. So he thought he was a magic man. He thought he had real ultimate power. He formulated a set of totally crazy beliefs based on like science fiction novels and biblical beliefs, which is just another form of science fiction from prior eras, right? But anyway, he kind of concocted this extremist worldview. Of course, it put himself in the center. And then his cult members kind of got sucked into his personal solution to his void problem, basically. And they dedicated themselves to this crazy dude and his kind of millenarian or doomsday fantasies, where the world would be destroyed by him and his followers, and then they would rebuild a new perfect world in their image, right? So their worldview um, was centered on religious beliefs formulated by this one crazy guy, right? So for whatever reason, all of these people in Japan in the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s decided that their own life had no purpose or meaning, and the only thing that would give them meaning is believing the bullshit of some complete lunatic cult leader, this Shoko Asahara guy, right? And there's a handful of other examples of that. Even just in the 90s, right? There's the Heaven's Gate cult. The leader of that cult was a total lunatic. I think his name was maybe Applewhite. I can't really remember off the top of my head. It doesn't really matter. I don't even want to look into the details all that much. But anyway, those people believed fervently in what this crazy dude thought. And they ended up committing suicide because they thought if they died, they would be reborn on a spaceship behind this comet that was coming through the solar system at the time, right? In like, I don't know, 1999 or whenever that was. These groups, the true believer groups, I think are kind of interesting. They can take on various forms, right? But they often revolve around really extreme actions and really extreme beliefs, right? The world is ending, therefore our completely crazy actions are totally justified. We could do anything we want, right? Through this channel that's opened up by this cult leader person, and then we'll get what we want on the other side. That never comes, obviously, right? So I think that's one species of cults and one species of attempt to resolve this divide by zero problem. I think another variation on this type of cult, right, an attempt to answer these big questions, fill in the void, solve the divide by zero error, is provided by a unique species of human, right? These people are cynics, manipulators, right? Their answer to this void problem is to lord over and control other people. So the void remains present at the center of this group, right? This set of unanswerable questions. They know there's no answer to it, but they go out there and manipulate the public by feeding them false answers, by feeding them bullshit, right? You'll see this type of group be very theatrical, be very manipulative, right? Pump out a lot of propaganda. Um, and it can encompass whole nations of people, tens of thousands to millions of people. Tens of thousands of millions of people can get suckered into this particular worldview, right? So you have all these people out there who have the same problem, this void problem, this divide by zero problem, the center of their consciousness. And then you get a con man, politician, a big sales force pushing PR and propaganda. And this group of people will decide, okay, that's the solution to this void problem. So I'm going to buy into that. And this has happened numerous times in recent centuries, right? Like entire groups of people, entire populations, entire ethnic groups have been swept up by charismatic charlatans who want to put them into this like LARPer fantasy land cosplay scenario, which this group of people will decide, oh, this solves all my life's problems. So I think these cynical manipulator cults are maybe the most widespread variant on this theme, right? So, where Shoko Asahara was a true believer in his bullshit, these cynical manipulator people essentially create the bullshit to sell to the public. So the cynical manipulators don't really believe it. They don't necessarily buy into it themselves. They know that they actually invented it, to manipulate people. But I think they can have two different, like, two broad, I guess, categories of like reasoning to do this, right? So one category is they think they're doing the public a favor by giving them something to do, right? By inventing a gamified reality, like a LARPer reality, selling that to the public, they're giving the public meaning, right? So the cynical manipulator knows that life is basically meaningless, knows this void problem is unsolvable, etc. But they think, okay, my role as a person who knows this information is to try to help these deluded people through their life by giving them bullshit to keep them deluded, basically, right? So they have this kind of strange type of nihilism, right? It's this weird nihilistic perspective that I think is really prevalent in the world today. And I think one of the great groups or one of the groups that epitomizes this is the neocon Jews, right? This is their worldview to a T, I think. And I think Zionism, right? The Zionists in general, I think they're just a specific variant of the Zionists. They have that worldview. Another group of people like that were the Nazis, the German nationalists, right? Their concept of nationhood and trying to get the public to really buy into it was a species of this specific uh, sort of nihilistic, weirdo, LARPing belief system, right? So the people at the center know it's bullshit, but they think, okay, it's our duty to do this and foist this nonsense off on the public because the public needs this nonsense, right? So they think they're the higher person, right, in this relationship. That is, the scammer is higher in consciousness than the scamee, right? So they're not after the truth. They're not after sharing the truth. They just decide the world is meaningless, and the only way to give people meaning is to lie to them and get them to commit, right, to have a very serious hobby, essentially, of being a crazy nationalist or whatever, right? So this, I think, is the worldview of this specific kind of cynical manipulator group of people. I think the Nazis are a really great example of this cynical manipulator group, right? And if you look at the flow of ideas, like how this idea was replaced by that idea or whatever, this attempt to fill in this void problem, right? The German nationalists attempt to fill in the void problem. It makes a lot of sense when you look at it in the bigger picture of like the flow of ideas through the 19th and into the 20th century, right? So you have the age of reason and science essentially undermine and make Christianity largely irrelevant, right? As an intellectual force, as a way to explain the world. Sure, there's still religious people. There's still Zoroastrians today, right? So the Zoroastrian religion, for example, is practiced in various parts of Iran. But Zoroastrianism had its heyday, thousands of years ago, right? So sure, there's still Catholics today. The Catholic Church is still huge, etc. But as an intellectual force, like a leading intellectual force, it's been marginalized, severely marginalized. And the core of Christianity, that is literal belief in the tenets of the Bible, had been obliterated, through the 19th and into the 20th century. Sure, there's still people who believe the Bible is literally true and it's a history book, but they're just uneducated people, right? So for the educated people, um, that had been rendered into, or Christianity and the Bible specifically had been made into just another mythology like the Greek myths or whatever, right? So as a force for defining a people, it had lost a lot of its power, had been discredited. So then the children of the ages of science and reason decided the thing to replace it was basically a history LARPer cult, right? So you get rid of this universal church idea and gods and the Bible, take that and you throw it in the trash, or maybe you graft on top of it this history cult, this LARPer cult, right? And this cosplay cult too, right? With little medals, specific types of boots and outfits that were designed by German designers and that kind of thing, right? So you take that previous cult and that previous worldview, you throw it in the trash, and you replace it with this LARPer cosplay cult, right? And that really took off, and it really, fired up the public in Germany. Apparently, their economy was roaring, right? It was a very creative time for those people. At the same time, it's a very destructive time, right? So they start to act out like you see these crazy groups like Aum Shinrikyo or whatever. in a super destructive fashion. They are untethered from the previous morals and restraints of the era of Christianity, right? And the attempt to be like a good person through the biblical teaching and the beliefs that the Catholic Church harped on, right? So that was replaced with this antinomian, um, Superman destructive worldview, right? So the Nazis kind of embody that, and they're shown to believe that, right? In movies and TV shows, they're lampooned because they were kind of ridiculous, right? They really were just another freaking cult, just another group of pretty crazy people, right? So at the center of the Nazis, you had people who understood, oh, this is propaganda, this is bullshit, this is nonsense, right? Like stitching together these historical narratives, making, various historical characters into like essentially uh, heroes from like the age of Greece or whatever, right? Like putting these people up on a pedestal, like I don't know, you know, the Germanic tribes people who defeated the Romans here and there and that kind of thing, right? So you make those people into national heroes, build up this whole new historical narrative and sell it to the public, and they just go hog wild with it, right? So yeah, I think that is an interesting case to look at. It ultimately was quite destructive, right? Not to all the groups, not only to the groups that the Nazis attacked and defeated and conquered and killed and maimed, etc., but to especially the German people themselves. The German people in Germany were completely destroyed, right? Like Germany as a nation was completely destroyed, and to this day, it's under the thumb of the United States and the Zionists, right? So they got completely defeated, and they're completely controlled and occupied to this very day, all these years later, right? The United States, for example, destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, right, which provided natural gas from Russia to Germany. An act of war, a blatant act of war from the United States against the Germans. And there was no retaliation, right? Germany can't even act in its own economic or its own political interests. It's a completely subjugated vassal state, right? Completely controlled by people who hate their guts. To this day, right? That's pretty wild. So I think the Zionist Jews and groups of Zionists that I've actually had some interaction with in my personal life. I'm going to say the neocon Jews, right, and then affiliated neocon non-Jewish people. These groups of people, I'm just going to call them all Zionists, uh, have a similar approach to filling in this void problem um, as the German nationalists, right? In fact, they're borrowing from the same source material. That is, the Zionists borrowed from the same kind of philosophical source material. So, where earlier centuries had a religious worldview, right? Once that worldview was confronted by science and historical information, that worldview no longer made sense. These groups, like the German nationalists and then the Zionists, invented new quasi histories to embolden their people. And they thought that they were doing their people a big favor, right? So you had these consciously nihilistic groups, meaning they had still this void at the center of their own consciousness. These people, the Zionists in this case, just invented their own story and got their own people to become LARPers, cosplayers, and also tapped into this kind of antinomian uh, worldview to unleash hell essentially upon their so-called enemies, right? So the Germanic people went completely bananas in the 20th century and went out and tried to conquer their fellow European people. And then that caused immense harm to themselves, right? Destroyed essentially the German nation, which was a fiction to begin with, right? Germany was composed of a bunch of little tribes previously. Um, but I don't want to get into that story. That's not my main topic of interest here, right? And you see the Jews doing that same kind of thing today, the Zionist Jews, right? So you have a cynical group of manipulators at the center of those people, and that group of people might actually trace its origin back to the Frankists or the Sabbatean movement in 17th century Europe. I'm kind of wondering about that. I think that's something that's worth looking into. But anyway, you have this group of people selling this narrative to their own people, then to Western people as well. They've been pushing this for a long time in Western countries because they rely upon Western countries, especially the United States, for financial support, material, etc., for their little project over there in the Middle East. Their attempt to kind of completely destroy all opposition to their plans, right? And then to displace or completely rule over, lord over the millions upon millions of non-Jewish people in that region, right? It looks like this is what they're actually trying to do, and it's completely crazy, right? It's completely crazy, and the heart of this thing, like I'm saying here, or what I believe the heart of this thing to be, is this bizarre nihilism, right? The same kind of nihilism that the National Socialists had, right? Their leadership, that is a Zionist leadership, is cynical manipulators who is leading their people down this path of destruction, like ultimate destruction. And their main goal, that is the Zionist leaders' main goal, is to keep their public, keep their people afraid of everybody else, and at the same time lashing out at the rest of the world to try to destroy the rest of the world, and perhaps usher in, just like Am Shinrikyo, a new age where they lord over everybody by creating destruction all around the world, right? So these people look a whole lot like a death cult, like Am Shinrikyo, and then there are also these cynical manipulator types who think that they're doing the public, that is their public, their fellow blood people, doing these people a great favor by constantly lying to them, by bombarding them with propaganda all the time. Everybody hates you, but you're the worst, or you're the best people, that are the chosen ones, the chosen ones, beloved of God. But God always punishes you because you're bad. Blah blah blah. Right? This is just a bunch of insane propaganda from a tiny little cult of complete freaks, like complete freakazoid, destructive assholes, right? Just no different than the leadership of the Nazis or whatever, right? So while the Nazis are lampooned, made fun of, thought of as the most evil people that ever existed, you see the exact same shit going on with the Zionists and their little cabal of freaks, right? And, you know, not that many people are pointing it out, right? People are kind of afraid to point it out. And I think it does great harm, just like Nazism did very great harm to the German people, right? The German public. The Zionism looks pretty toxic and quite potentially ultra destructive to uh, the average Jewish person, right? And a lot of Jewish people don't buy into it, right? They're not part of it. There's all kinds of videos out there on YouTube of people, Jewish people who aren't Zionists. Um, so anyway, I think that's a really interesting topic. I don't want to like dwell on this too much though, right? It's really easy to fall into looking at these evil examples, right? Look at the trash bucket leadership of humanity and keep pointing at these people and keep saying, yeah, that's why everything's all fucked up. It's because the world is ruled by the ultimate trash. Um, I think that's kind of true, right? Those people are bad, but they're bad because, or they win out because the public's also bad, right? The public is easily swept into these movements because of this void problem, right? This thing that I'm discussing in these videos. Um, because people don't have a satisfactory answer to these big problems, they're swept into all of this insanity, right? It seems like that's the root cause of a lot of the shit in the world, a lot of the really horrible shit in the world. So I'm going to offer up uh, the life of three individuals, like a microbiography of these three individuals I'll discuss as counterexamples to the aforementioned groups, right? Like the National Socialists or the Zionists or people in Amshin and Rikio, right? This kind of group of people plus their either cynical or true believer cult leadership who decide to go down these insane paths time and time again in history, basically to try to solve this void problem, right? To try to assert that their existence, right, of their particular type of mind, this verbal and symbolic reasoning mode of consciousness mind, to assert that this thing will last forever, be all powerful, et cetera, like all of these kind of insane ideas that people can have. Um, and I want to offer these guys up as kind of an antidote to that, antidote by way of example, I guess, to that type of existence, right? And I think one of the things these people share in common, like this group of people shares in common, is they end up um, looking to the natural world, right? The 3D physical reality world. They look at that and find examples or find a way to live within the 3D physical reality world that reconciles their consciousness, right? This particular mode of consciousness with the order of things, right? They see that they're part of the order of things, and that they're maybe not alien to this Earth, this 3D physical reality world, right? They just kind of take their place in it and go on and live their life. Um, so I think Johnny Appleseed is a really good example of that kind of life, right? He lived on the American frontier in the early 19th century, like right after the birth of the United States, basically. He was living in what was then called the Northwest Territory in Ohio and Indiana and that kind of general region. Um, and he was a mystic, right? So he was a Christian mystic. He was an adherent of the teachings of this guy named Emanuel Swedenborg. I think that's the way you pronounce it. I might be wrong there, but Swedenborg uh, shared his own mystical experiences as a Christian with other people. Johnny Appleseed kind of seized on that somehow and went and lived his own individual life, right? So, one of the elements of mysticism that is distinct from the types of organized religions, these kind of corporate entities that I've described in previous videos, is it is a ration or not rationally, but it's a radically subjective experience. That is, it's all about you. That is your inner existence, right? Your this form of consciousness I'm discussing. Um, it tries to embrace the whole of things, right? To get beyond the limits imposed by this particular form of reasoning that I've discussed in the previous video, the kind of verbal and symbolic mode of reasoning, to have the fundamental experience of reality, right? To get past the limitations imposed by this sort of circular logic of the rational mind. And in so doing, it could transform a person or lead a person down a unique path. And that's what happened, I think, with Johnny Appleseed. So he was extremely kind, generous, right? He could be critical of others, etc. But he was, kind of a kind and generous guy, very careful and uh, careful and saw his role, I think, in the world as a sort of caretaker of nature. Right. So there's a story that he injured a wolf that became his companion, for example. Um, he put out a fire because he saw insects were dying in the fire. Right. So he turned into like super nature boy, basically. Right. He was a farmer, an apple tree farmer. He sold apple trees on the frontier to settlers. That was, his job. But he had this kind of bigger role for himself in the world as this sort of caretaker of the world, right? And he was highly regarded, maybe even revered by people who knew him in life. And he was a boundary crosser guy, right? He was living his own unique life, which enabled him to interact with the Native American tribes who lived in the Northwest Territory at the time, interact with the settlers, interact with these various groups, because he kind of transcended their simple world, right? The world that I've been describing in this video, the world of living in a big cult, basically, right? Or being dominated by a bunch of psychos in the national capital or whatever. He was a real individual doing his individual thing, right? Um, Another example is Richard Prenneke, Dick Prenneke, uh, not nearly as famous as Johnny Appleseed, but has some kind of similar characteristics, I think. So Dick Prenneke had essentially a revelation, right? He became very sick with, I think, rheumatic fever as an adult, right? He almost died when he had rheumatic fever, and when he became healthy, he recovered from it. He realized, oh, I don't want to live in the corporate consumer world in the United States, kind of sleepwalk down the road of insanity with my fellow man. I'm going to go do my own thing and live up in Alaska. So he moved up to Alaska, built his log cabin, and kind of lived a simple life in harmony with the natural world to a certain degree. He wasn't completely removed from civilization, right? He wasn't trying to live 100% off grid and be 100% self sufficient, but he just wanted to get away from kind of the insanity of uh, the average person's life in the United States. And he filmed his exploits. He filmed what he was doing up there, and he kept journals. He was a naturalist, right, observing nature, kind of learning from nature. And then he shared that information with us, right, to anybody who cares to learn from him. So there's some DVDs out there that have some of the footage he took. There's books that were compiled from his journals later on, and he's just this kind of sort of inspirational individual, right? He decided to go live off in Alaska and live this particular life that many people would like to follow, right? In fact, he inspired me not to go live in Alaska, but I realized, oh, I don't have to go move to basically live this type of life. I can just stay where I am here in Northeast Ohio on my heavily wooded property and do some of the things that he was doing, right? I don't have to be thousands of miles away from this highly settled, you know, relatively high population density area. I can just do the same kind of things where I live, right? Um, so I think one of the things to point out with Dick Prenneke is he has this revelatory experience and then goes and lives on his own unique path, right? And if Johnny Appleseed had that, I'm not sure, but maybe he did. Another person who's got sort of a similar approach, I guess I wouldn't say approach, or had another revelatory experience and then decided to live a completely different way and discarded the not the corporate consumer life, but the kind of organized mode of living imposed by the United States in the 20th century is this guy Masanobu Fukuoka. So he had this brush with illness, this brush with death that led him to discard all the things that he had learned in school about farming. Right, he was a scientist, a biologist of some type, agronomist, agriculture person of some type. And when he had this brush with death via pneumonia, I think, he had a revelation about farming that led him to discard all the things he had learned and then pursue this kind of natural farming um, method, right? And to devote his life to it, to learning it, aligning himself with nature, and then bringing that into agricultural practices. And he was pretty successful at it. And he managed to operate his rice farm using those techniques successfully, right? So he realized, we don't need herbicides and pesticides. Uh, Nature knows what it's doing. Human management, right? This, which all comes from uh, this realm I've been talking about, right? The information dimension, the entity of this information dimension thinks, oh, the natural world that would fall apart completely if we weren't managing it, right? That is, if we, the consciousnesses, the alien visitors to this planet, weren't managing things, it would all fall apart. You see that now, right? You see that to this day. Oh, if we don't control the thermostat of the world in CO2, we'll have runaway greenhouse effect and the world will be destroyed, right? That is, if the human beings don't control the world as if they had a thermostat, if Bill Gates doesn't do it or Al Gore doesn't do it or whatever, everything's going to run off the rails and everything will be destroyed. So this guy, Masanobu Fukuoka, like he might share some of those same types of environmentalist concerns, right? Which I think are extremely valid. And, I think his point is like civilization isn't all it's cracked up to be, and chewing up the planet and organizing the planet for the sake of these kind of alien visitors, right? This mode of consciousness, which is essentially an alien visitor that doesn't know what the fuck it's doing at all. So if we lived more in accord with the natural order of things, life would be really way better for everybody involved, the plants, the animals, the people, and we would be living probably the way we're supposed to live, right? So this revelation led him to live his own unique life, follow his own unique path, and then he just shared it with other people as well, right? So when you look at these three individuals I discussed, it would be wrong, I think, to follow them in a cult-like way, right? To kind of put them up on a pedestal, revere and worship them. But I think it would be appropriate to look at their lives and then try to learn from their life so that you or me or whatever consciousness could get on that path and live a unique individual's life and kind of get more in harmony with the natural order of things, and presumably living that way would turn the world into a much better place, right? So instead of creating hell over and over and over again, right, like these cult-like groups, religions do, etc., you can make things really quite positive, right? Think of the difference here, right? Think of one of the other big differences here between these two approaches to life. Religion, corporate organizations, they want monocultures, really very simple organization of the world, destruction of anything that doesn't fit in with their little plan, their little schemes, right? Where these individuals having a much smaller scope of life, doing their own little creative research and development projects, with respect to farming, or Dick Proenneke making little tools and ways to live out in the wilderness, Johnny Appleseed living out there on the frontier, learning his own way to plant apple trees and develop apple varieties, etc. You have these kind of creative individuals living what would be regarded as a small life, but their life is very productive and creative. Whereas in these monoculture scenarios, you can believe whatever stupid bullshit the leadership is selling, the psychopaths and narcissistic freakazoids that dominate, the societies of like the Western world and much of the world today. You can just become a cog in the machine. You can't even have a contrary idea, right? Like there's corporations where you basically have to swear fealty to the leadership, right, to do your stupid job making widgets or writing computer programs or whatever, and they'll make you take like an oath or something, right? Oh, I believe this or that thing about this fucking corporation, right? You become like a minion of these fucking weirdo people, and then you just turn the crank in corporate America, chew up the natural world essentially to make products to keep the financial system flowing along, right? It's pretty insane, right? That whole world, living in that whole kind of crazy cult-like world, is not the life of a human being, right? These are the lives of human beings. That's this guy Masanobu Fukuoka, Dick Proenneke, Johnny Appleseed, and there's myriad other examples out there. There's myriad people living like that today. Um, that's the real human life. To be a minion, to be a member of, say, like the military, renders you into like a 16th of a human being, right? It strips away all the uniquely human traits and it makes you into a little drone, right? Corporation, right? Like living the corporate life, maybe you're 1/8 of a human being, right? Especially if you're really into it, you become a servant of this fucking company, right? To make money for investors and shareholders, right? You surrender your unique life to be a participant in the pyramid system, right? This kind of top-down system that we have. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting and enjoyable. Hope there was some food for thought there. Have a good day.